Ladies and gentlemen, and everybody in between, welcome to the program. It occurs to me that 6 months into the show, that's the first time you might have heard, at least on this program, the theme song for the program in its entirety, Human Being by Cat Power. In so many ways, that song and many other things and people was the impetus for this show, at least when we were sitting together as a group and trying to pick a theme song. Something to introduce the show. That one went to the front of the line and really seems to speak to the atmosphere we're trying to create and the message we're trying to put out there. That you, as an individual, your creativity, your spirituality, your process, your story matters. And as a friend of the show, Lydia Yuknovich, says, you're the only one who can tell it the way you can tell it. And the health of the planet, the health of the species is an all hands on deck kind of endeavor. And so the show has really been about providing these stories of transformation of people that have found ways to turn the hand they've been given in life into something meaningful and productive and beautiful for themselves and for the community, right? So we can look to these models as we encounter great stress and great trials in our own lives, in our personal lives, in our professional lives, as the political climate changes, as the climate changes. We have some things to fall back on as far as templates for people who have used adversity to better themselves and go deeper into the human experience. So Cat Power, along with the rest of the music we try to pick for the show, really speaks to that in a way that I hope is meaningful to you as it is to us as a group here making the show. Our guest for this week is somebody I'm very excited about. It's the Emmy-nominated filmmaker, speaker, Webby Awards founder, Tiffany Shlain. Tiffany, God, has received dozens and dozens of awards and distinctions as a filmmaker and a speaker. Newsweek magazine said she was one of the women who would shape the 21st century. Her films have premiered at Sundance and at every other festival, and she's, as I said, won all kinds of awards. She's spoken at Google and Harvard and NASA. Her film Connected is how I became aware of her work. And it's a film about, as the title says, connectivity. Really fascinated in technology. Many of the guests we've had on the show, I'm thinking of Mikey Siegel, and then upcoming guests like Douglas Rushkoff, speak to ways that technology is shaping and is being shaped by the human condition, right? Back in the 90s, and I've just been reading through Douglas Rushkoff's last book, Present Shock. He's got a new book on the way out that I'm going to be reading before he's a guest on our show here in May. About, for so much of the 20th century, and I would even argue going back to the 15th and 16th century, this notion of progress and infinite progress and kind of unchecked, non-critical belief in the future, whether it was a religious one or a technological one or a business-inspired one, or, the arrival of aliens, whatever it was. Douglas points this out as well, and I'll tie this all into Tiffany in a minute. There was this, especially towards the end of the 90s, as I said, there was this crazy belief in a technology-driven future, and it exists still to this day. We talk about, I kid about how Duncan Trussell and Ramez Nam and other folks follow the Kurtz Wild notion of, the singularity, this technologically driven transhuman future that's just around the corner that's going to change everything and eliminate disease and eliminate the whole notion of scarcity and poverty and hunger on the planet. And so there's that view, right? That this utopian view that just around the corner is an infinite period of bliss for humanity. And what people like Rushkoff and others have pointed out is that mentality has been used, to create a lot of chaos and a lot of genocide and a lot of destruction and death in our species, especially through the 20th century. But towards the end of the 90s, there was this idea that the future technology was going to lead us into these new landscapes. And then after the turn of the century, in the sort of Web 2.0 or 3.0 or 7.0, wherever we are now, after that happened, everything sort of changed, and we've now found ourselves in this sort of ever-present but detached now. I mean, if you can think back to the early 1990s when there were only 50 public websites, right? But now there are billions and billions, or at least tens of millions. I know that the internet doubles in size every 9 to 11 days, mostly with people's status updates and tweets and pictures of their cats and what they ate for dinner. But nonetheless, right, that's not just what's going on the internet, but that's a good portion of it. But whatever, people are putting their lives onto the web and interacting with one another across these vast distances and time and space instantaneously, and never before has there been this much connectivity in the world. And that's what Tiffany is exploring in her film Connected, and in the other work she does, is how has this enhanced connectivity changed our species, and where are we going, and where can we go? What's the potential for this technology to bring us closer together as a species? What is the internet as a sort of young hive mind of our species that is progressing in ways that we have some ability to help determine what that says about ourselves and the kind of people we want to become? Douglas, looking at this present shock issue, right? What is it to be in this sort of ever-present now? Again, the world of status updates and tweets and tumblers and swiping left and right on one another. It's not a Buddhist immersion in the present, right? It's not a sort of ever-present now that comes when one studies the perennial philosophy or or meditates or goes deep into the essence of the present moment. It's an immersion in the now that is incredibly superficial and rooted in our reptilian brain's sort of pre-rational decision making. It's in a present, ever present now that takes us out of, ironically, the moment, out of the surround, and connects us to this fleeting notion of the present that we can never quite get a hold of. And so in many ways, it's sort of the opposite of the now that we are supposed to be immersed in from a Buddhist standpoint. And so these theorists and these people that are looking at these technologies, right, and studying how are they changing us, right? How are they changing how we relate to one another, how we understand ourselves, how we understand our own lives. Tiffany Shlain is an artist and a filmmaker who is on the forefront of that. I bring up guys like Rushkoff because, excuse me, for me, I sort of put her in that category, right? These thinkers, these critics who are looking at the world and looking at these emerging technologies and speaking to how they're changing us, right, and how they're changing our species. Fascinating stuff to bring to you, and something that I'm just infinitely interested in. I hope you are as well. I became aware of Tiffany's work actually through her father, a guy by the name of Leonard Shlain. And if you are not familiar with Leonard's work, he was a neurologist who actually died in 2009, but wrote several books through the 80s and 90s. A couple I want to quickly mention: Art and Physics, which is a great book that looked at this notion of so many of the breakthroughs that have happened in the world of science, right? So many materialist science breakthroughs in terms of our understanding of the physical world and of the physical universe had come sometimes 100, 150 years after those discoveries, if you will, were intuited in the world of art. You know, before psychologists were talking about the subconscious, artists were painting it. Before physicists were talking about the atom, artists were painting it. So it's a fascinating book that looks at how the creative mind is sometimes ahead of the rational mind in intuiting things about the nature of reality. I read another book that was extremely influential for me and for my work, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, that looks at the beginning of human civilization and how, from Schlain's perspective, not only as Chris Ryan and others have talked about, large-scale industrial agriculture, the invention of warfare, and high civilization led to a rewiring of the human brain. But what Shlain looks at is the infamous cuneiform that I've spoken about or attempted to speak about when I said Sanskrit, now infamously on Chris Ryan's show, and I think here on the block as well. But how cuneiform, the original Sumerian scribes, which did not write it as a linear language, actually when it was turned into a linear script by later civilizations, the Akkadians and so forth, that this began a rewiring of our brains into left hemisphere dominant meme machines, right? And one bit of evidence for this is right-hand dominance in our species, which is something we've absolutely culturally coded for in order to create a species of left hemisphere dominant thinkers, right? So lots of work there, and there's some great theorists, not to get too sidetracked, but people like Ian McGilchrist and others who are looking at this right brain, left brain stuff, Jill Bolte Taylor, and revisiting what is going on there, because we explored it a bit in the late 60s, but then stepped away from it because some of those early ideas about the right brain was creative and the left brain was rational, and some of those things have been disproven. But there are distinct differences between the two that are being explored again. But Tiffany's work stands on its own. You know, it's amazing. As I say to her in the interview, it's fascinating to talk about somebody like Leonard in his own right, but then to see her carrying on his work and then taking it into new areas by founding the Webbies, by being such a presence online, and by taking his work and applying it to this new digital landscape. I just think it's a great companion to the work of Rushkoff and Mikey Siegel and others who are leading us into this new digital space and helping us to find ourselves in it. Lastly, before we get to the episode, I want to give a quick listener dedication this week to Matty Robinson. This is a guy that we've known for a couple of years, a friend of the show, friend of ours. Helped us last week with the Sean Davis episode with some prep, some of those questions. I asked the guy to help out, and his head nearly exploded, jumping at the chance, and really came through for us with some fantastic research and interesting questions for Sean. And I hope to work with Matt some more in the future. This is a guy that's so humble. Anytime you try to give him a compliment, he shakes it off. He's a good father, spectacular writer. Another one of these veterans who is healing himself through the written word, through story. And the fact that he shares that with all of us is just a gift that I can't even imagine how special it is to be a part of that. So, Matthew, with listeners like you, man, who needs enemies? And we keep doing the show for guys like you. So we're glad you listen. We're glad you're a part of it. And we're glad you folks are here with us as well. We got Tiffany Shlain coming up and some great things for you on the horizon. Stay with us. We got some great guests in the coming weeks. Ronald Reagan's daughter, Patty Davis, will be on the show. The music of the Obo Adi Legacy Project, and some other great surprises around the corner. We appreciate you being with us, and we hope you enjoy the show. We'll see you folks on the other side.
Welcome to On the Block with Andrew Gurovich, a podcast about authentic people doing beautiful things. Enjoy the show.
All right, welcome to the program, folks. This is your host, Andy Gurovich, and I am excited for this week's guest. Our guest this week is Tiffany Shlain. Tiffany, welcome to the program.
It's good to be on.
You know, we've been in contact off and on for the past couple of years since I became aware of your work. When I started this show, the show, as you know, as I talked to you when we were prepping for you to come on, is about transformation. We talk to people who experience profound change in their life and profound loss frequently, and then go on to turn that into something of profound meaning for themselves, and that we all can share in some meaningful way. And so our guests, we've been very fortunate to have a lot of really wonderful people come on the show who have shared those stories with us and have been really inspirational. But one of the things that I think is great about you right here at the outset is that I think you're the first generational transformational change agent we've had on the program. So I'm really, really excited to talk to you.
I like that.
Yeah.
Generational, transformational. It sounds like there's a rhyme in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like a Saul Williams song or something. Yeah. So, I mean, for our listeners who aren't familiar with your father's work, I thought we could maybe spend a couple of minutes talking about him and your relationship to him, and especially maybe leading up to the movie Connected, and then lead on to some of the other stuff you have going on. So your father was the neurologist and author Leonard Shlain. I'm telling you this as if this is news to you.
Yeah, he was an amazing man. He was a surgeon by trade, and then self-taught in an array of fields, and wrote best-selling books about the connections between art and science back in the 80s, before people were really talking about that. Mm-hmm. Then he wrote a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, which looked at what was the event that kept happening in civilization that brought women down?
Yeah.
Why did all the goddesses change to gods, mm-hmm. and women lost their power? And he believed it was because of literacy. Whenever literacy was introduced, it really changed both our brains and the societal structure to very left brain and linear thinking. Mm-hmm. It's very male at the subjugation of women, which is very right brain and image based. And now that we're having the internet and the rise of images, that women are regaining their power. So he wrote that, and then he wrote a book called Sex, Time, and Power: How Female Sexuality Shaped Human Evolution. And then his last book looked at how he believed that Leonardo da Vinci represented the future of our species, being both completely evolved in both his right and left hemisphere, being gay, vegan, and a pacifist, and very evolved in his thinking about lots of things. And he actually finished that book literally days before he died, and it was an unedited manuscript. And my brother and sister, Jordan and Kimberly, we in the last several years got it published. So that just went out into the world. It's called Leonardo's Brain: Understanding Da Vinci's Creative Genius.
When was that book released?
Last October.
That's full disclosure. That's the only one of his books that I have not read. And just to talk a little bit about the ones you've mentioned by name, and we'll put these on our site for our listeners to check out. But Art in Physics was a book that you're absolutely right, at least to my knowledge, kind of presaged a lot of the conversation that now is happening among people that study neuropsychology and the arts. That that artists throughout history were able to somehow intuit advances that were coming in the sciences well nigh 100, 150 years before they actually occurred in the sciences. And there's a way you could talk about what was happening there in terms of how the brain, in a collective kind of Jungian way, was processing these things, and that artists, through their ability to work with dreams and work with images and work with the things that come from the subconscious mind, were able to get at some of those ideas sooner, things that advancements in physics. He talks extensively in that book about, well before Freud, we had artists that were painting the subconscious, the collective subconscious, and these Freudian sorts of fears and images that were leaping off of the canvas well before Freud actually was able to write them into a sort of coherent, quasi-scientific construction. So that book, is that sort of, am I?
Yeah. I mean, he looks at artists as the antennas of culture, and they're often expressing ideas and images that scientists will later articulate in numbers and equations or in words. And he goes really throughout history, and so many examples, like when Seurat's pointillism, the painting with the dots, happened, was right before the scientists discovered molecules. And he really, it's striking how many examples he can find where these artists and scientists were not in communication. They were often just very segregated. I think it less so now, and they were often talking about the same ideas, one with images and one with numbers and equations.
He really is. I want to talk about the other couple of books you mentioned as well. But he's such a great character because he's a Renaissance man. So he's, like you said, he's self-taught across a number of disciplines. But his training in brain science really helped him open the doors and see those connections in ways that a lot of folks prior to hadn't, right? He really, being at the forefront of that, right, of that as a brain scientist, really opened the doors for him to make these connections in really profound ways and bring together science and mysticism in ways that rooted it in the scientific, that explained it in a way that made sense to the world.
Absolutely. I think it was his grounding in science and his deep understanding of the human body and evolution that really gave him an unusual perspective to kind of make these bridges and leaps and connections that people hadn't made before. And so threaded throughout all of his books is his knowledge of the body and the evolution of the brain. And that's a nice through line, actually, in all of his books. The brain was a very profound focus in my upbringing. In fourth grade, it was like, bring your parent to school day, and he brought a big bucket and taught us all about the brain. And at the end of the class, he lifted up the lid of the bucket, and there was a brain in formaldehyde.
Wow.
Wow.
With the spinal cord and everything attached, or?
No, it was just the brain. I remember. But we, my mom was getting her PhD in psychology at the time, so we were talking about the brain and the mind all the time, and that's really influenced a lot of my films. Are about the brain and about neuroscience.
What was it like, before I go on to, some of the questions about the other books, what was it like to, you guys were close, I remember from the film, so you say growing up with him was kind of a trip, huh? I mean, what was that like for you?
We were incredibly close, and it was wonderful. We talked, of course, when I was growing up, he was just an incredible father, and my bedtime stories were The Formation of Art and Physics, that book.
Wow.
And he always had a pen, and at dinner he would write out his surgeries he'd done, and he'd have like blood still splattered on his glasses sometimes, and he'd be charting the surgeries he'd do.
It's really remarkable.
He would, he built a geodesic dome in our backyard with the help of all the neighbors, I saw when I was a young child, I used to see auras, and he was always fascinated with that. He would ask me a lot about it, and we were always just incredibly close. And then, he was my best friend. We, just as I got older, it even became more interesting, the conversations, because I hopefully got wiser.
One of the things I'm interested in, I actually two questions about that. As a person who had so much training in the brain, was he aware of, and did he talk about the sort of somatic nervous system as well, the other ways of knowing that the body has that aren't mediated primarily through brain? Was he interested in that?
He was actually in Leonardo's brain. He goes into stuff with ESP, and I mean, he was a seeker of and a curious mind about absolutely everything. So anything that was out, I mean, he always was grounded in science, but he had a spiritual side. He would probably for a long time say he was an atheist or agnostic, but he was incredibly spiritual in nature. We always went river rafting, and but he had some pretty far out ideas about communication. Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm going to pursue a couple of those with you. One more question about that. We had our very first guest that we had on this show was a guy named Adam Klugman. I don't know if you know Adam or his work, but he was the son of the late actor Jack Klugman, the guy who was on The Odd Couple and all his Twilight Zone episodes. And Adam was an activist and a author and a media person, and got a great story on his own right. And when we were talking with him about his father, just to hit the pause button for a second, in the coming weeks, Patty Davis is coming on the show, and Patty's coming on to talk about her great new book, The Earth Breaks in Colors, and she is coming on to talk about her writing and doesn't want to talk about her family, right? Because she's been asked about it 8 million times. What's it like to be Ronald Reagan's daughter, right? I mean, how many times can she answer that question? And so the question I have for you, and I'm setting it up by giving you those two examples, is when you have a parent that it has some notoriety, right? That is a person of some fame and some notoriety. Was that difficult for you as a child? Because some of these kids talked about how as a kid, they thought the focus should be on them, in their families, but then they go out in public and it's, oh, there's Lenny Shlain's daughter, right? And was that difficult for you ever, or was that something that you embraced and felt proud of, his accomplishments?
Yeah, I never felt that. I mean, I suppose probably, my dad was like an intellectual rock star, so different than maybe being a film. I mean, no, he and I spoke at a lot of the same conferences, and, I've kept my, happily married for, 18 years, but I have my father's last name. So and especially after losing him, I find it like it keeps my engagement when so many people say, "Are you Leonard Shlain's daughter?" And it just gives me this opportunity to think about him and hear their thoughts about him, and it keeps him very alive for me. And then when I was younger, I'm a filmmaker, and my first half of my career was doing the Webby Awards, and he wrote a lot about technology. So a lot of people would say, "Oh, you're so much, apple doesn't fall too far from the tree," or "You're so much your parents' child." And I love that. I'm close with both my mom and dad, so I would hope that I would be. And my work is probably most similar to my dad's, just my talks and my films. His lectures were very visual, and the technology just wasn't quite there then for him to show videos in his talks.
Mm-hmm.
But he showed just a rapid fire of amazing images. And, in my films, I'm doing films where I'm showing amazing images and talking about big ideas. So it's so much an evolution of his work.
Yeah, you actually just led us right into what I was going to ask you about. And we're going to go to our first break here in a minute. But one of the things that fascinates me about you and that I want to get into here in a minute, I could talk to you about your dad for the next hour and a half, but the great thing about what you're doing is I see your work as a kind of continuation of and an application of his work. It's almost as if all those conversations you had at the dinner table and sort of, the bedtime stories from art and physics, that you kind of grew up with this stuff really, literally like epigenetically in your cells. And then as a filmmaker, you just applied those theories to your art. And so it's such an interesting way to move his work forward, because you're not just going around giving talks about your dad's work, right?
No.
You've actually taken it and transcended it and applied it in all of these ways that I think are so fascinating, and that I know he would just be tickled to death to see. I probably worded that poorly, but you know what I mean? Yeah, unfortunately, but I hope you get the sentiment there. Hopefully my producer can cut out that moronic comment later, but we'll take that out in post.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I feel like, I'm doing what he talked about, to merge both the art and the science into one. And I love what you said, that epigenetically I've kind of, through osmosis, that's what my work is. And, I met my husband, Ken Goldberg, he's an artist and a scientist, and he went to hear my dad speak about art and physics because it was one of his favorite books. And
wow.
That's how we met. And so our household is very much about art and science and the merging of those two. And our eldest daughter, wants to be a doctor and a writer. And so it's just like, it is in our DNA to embrace both the science and the art and to create from.
This is the reunification of the hemispheres. You guys are living it. All right, we're going to go to break and work out this audio issue and come right back. And I want to talk to you about the Webbies and all the stuff you have going on with your partner and everything else. That work for you?
That sounds great.
All right, folks, you're listening to On the Block Radio. Our guest is the filmmaker Tiffany Shlain, and we will be back right after these words.
You've been listening to On the Block, a podcast for bonobos only. No chimps allowed. Be right back.
The moment my son saw a redwood tree.
It's huge!
Is the moment I knew that for him,
you can't even see the top of that thing.
Even the sky has no limit.
There are some moments only the forest can inspire. Find yours at discovertheforest.org. Learn about forests near you and discover cool things to do when you go, like hiking, biking, fishing, or camping. Or do your own thing when you get there with family and friends. Your moment is out there. Find it at discovertheforest.org. That's discovertheforest.org.
Brought to you by the U.S. Forest Service and the Ad Council.
Welcome back to the program. This is your host, Andy Gurbich, and we are speaking with Tiffany Shlain. And when we left, we were speaking about your father's work in art and physics, and the alphabet versus the goddess, and the book Sex, Time, and Power. And I could take the next 2 hours and talk about both of those books. Alphabet versus the Goddess was so influential in my work, and it's how I became aware of his work, and then through that your work. In my work on Paleolithic religion, because I've written and published a bit on the Paleolithic cave art. and speaking about it really in terms of, I kind of came to your father's work through that, talking about that cave art, and I've spoken about this on this show before, as a really interesting artifact, because it comes from a time when we were pre-literate as a species, and when we hadn't really differentiated yet too much. I mean, we had these sort of loose clan-based and tribal affiliations, but for the most part, humans were just humans, 35,000 years ago. And so these images were produced by ancestors that literally connect to every living person on the planet. And they speak to us in a very elemental way about our connection to the natural world and to the cosmos, and they're very immediate in the way that they do that. And so they're a kind of visual, symbolic language of the first attempts to sort of graphically represent symbolic consciousness. And as such, it's the kind of birthplace of humans' symbolic thinking, and at least in a lurch forward. And it's obviously very feminized. You go to the center of Chauvet Cave, right, and at the very center of it, surrounded by a group of lions who sit guarding the center, is a stalactite that comes down with a human female, the body of a human woman, the only human form in the cave. And so this very goddess-oriented symbolism that speaks right to the work your father was doing. So it's great that you had that sort of pedigree, right? That were you raised in the Bay Area?
Yeah, Northern California in the 70s.
And so how did you get into the work you do with filmmaking?
Well, growing up, every Sunday night we went to dinner and the movies. I mean, that was a very steady tradition. But I never thought I could be a filmmaker. I thought I was supposed to be a doctor. So, but then I went to UC Berkeley, and I took a lot of, liberal arts, science, sociology, philosophy, and I took an elective film history class. And I just loved how I had this great professor, Marilyn Fabe, and she had this infectious excitement about how breakthroughs in technology with film would ultimately change the way we recorded culture, and then change culture and kind of ripple culture forward, evolving. I just loved that idea, the power to make change in the world. So I started making films really by cutting together old movies, because UC Berkeley did not have production at the time. And then I took a summer production class at NYU, and and then when I graduated from school, I really paid for my films working in technology, because I was always very interested in technology. So I went back and forth, like paying for my films, getting into debt on a movie, working in tech. I worked in CD-ROM. I worked in all these things to get me out. And then the first time I saw the web, which was in the early 90s, I was like, this is going to change the world. And I came back to San Francisco. I had been living in Seattle. And I was given the opportunity to kind of create the Webby Awards from scratch. And I made all these films for the Webbies. And usually I would introduce each show with a short film about how I felt technology was changing the world. And I rode that wave, it was the perfect timing in terms of the web, and the Webbies just took off like a rocket. And
yeah, you want to talk about right place, right time. The fact that you had that foresight to see, I'm sure you have, did you see the documentary We Live in Public?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what was that guy's name again? That dude that had that started that commune in New York where everyone was like.
It was a very New York perspective. San Francisco was so different than that time in New York, but and that film absolutely captured the kind of craziness of that period.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were in San Francisco in the 90s, I was in my 20s running the Webbies, and just felt like you were in the center of the world. Like every cover of every magazine was the web. I mean, actually, not when when I first started it, I mean, people were like, the what? What is this thing? And they didn't understand it. But, my goal with creating an award show model that people understood, and, honoring excellence and saying, this is the best, and let's push this further each year and push this medium forward. It was just very exciting. So
I think it's worth noting for folks just to camp on that for a minute, because you were really one of the first people to talk about web content in its own right? Because in the early 90s, we had content providers, big media companies that would put things on the web. But still, at that point, the New York Times would write a story that would go into their paper, and then they would like also post that story on the website. Or if a news station did a story for the evening news, they would also post that the clip to that segment. But it was basically reposting repurposed content that had been made for something else, right? And so not only the big innovation of user-generated content, right, of the fact that people would be making content and putting it on the internet, but the fact that media companies would then be making content for exclusively the internet. Now what we see now, which is all of this innovation with Amazon Prime and with Netflix and Hulu and all of these things that aren't just aggregating content that was broadcast, but producing content for the internet. Our very show here and the explosion in podcasting is another thing that's come, internet radio, from kind of your vision to see that people were going to be producing high quality content for the internet, and that there would be opportunities for advertising and revenue streams and artistry and everything else. And so you really were in the right place at the right time, but you had the vision to see that then.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I think, then the crash happened, I'll also say, that was a really interesting period because after, the press and everyone had just shined so much light on the web.
Yeah.
When the financial part started going down, which I really look at, it was like the public's way of funding the R&D of the internet. And they just went after it for blood. And I remember everyone was saying, oh, the internet, it was just a fad. It's just going to go away. And I was like, it's not going away. And, there's bloodshed and, companies going under, and we had to lay off some of our staff and everyone. But it was like, this is not going away, people. This is a transition. And there was a lot of ideas that, were R&D. And it was such an interesting time. There was the internet crash, the first one in 2001 or 2000. And then there was 9/11, which happened in 2001. And I felt like everyone did soul searching that period of time. And that was the time when I really wanted to go back to film combined with everything I had learned about the web through doing the Webby Awards and put those things together to make social change. And that's when I started looking to sell the Webby Awards and started my film studio. And yeah, so it's interesting because this year it's the Webby's 20-year anniversary, which is crazy. I mean, so the first decade of my life was the Webby Awards, and now I've spent a decade making films combined with the web to make change. And it's interesting when your life falls into these two big buckets of time.
Your film company is the Moxie Institute?
Yeah, well, I have the Moxie Institute and Let It Ripple. And Let It Ripple is really becoming the bigger entity. And we do everything from, the Moxie Institute, we do The Future Starts Here, which is an original series of short films that explore science and tech and creativity. And then we also host something called Character Day, which really brings everyone around the world together to focus one day on who they are and who they want to be. And that's really for schools and organizations who want to have a special day, a little pause in the crazy life. And we provide all these free films and discussion kits. And that's our nonprofit side of what we do. And then we also do art installations, and I do a lot of speaking about all these various things.
Was Connected the first major film project that your company did?
Yeah, Connected. Well, actually, so when I was running the Webbies, my first film I did that was kind of outside of the Webbies in that period was called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And it got into Sundance, and it was for Planned Parenthood, about shining the light on the importance of reproductive rights. And that was my first film where I used the web to engage people with this issue, with this short film. And video had just started being put on the web. And then after that, I made a film that also premiered at Sundance called The Tribe. And that explored American Jewish identity through the history of the Barbie doll.
Wow.
And we made a discussion kit for that. That was an 18-minute film. And then Connected was my first feature documentary that premiered at Sundance in 2011, and then went on to have theatrical and all of that. So that, yeah, Connected was kind of the mothership film.
I just want to say before I ask you about Connected, regarding that first film, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank goodness that that's no longer an issue, right? That there's no longer a need to talk about Planned Parenthood or
Oh
reproductive
my
rights
God.
for women.
I cannot believe it's still such an issue. It's like I keep updating the ending of that movie with the stats. It just makes me so frustrated.
Good on you for being there to shine a light on that conversation even back then. With our show, this is a show that tends away from the political, and we don't talk about topical issues too much, but it does, I think it is worth noting that the two individuals that put together those videos that were trying to implicate Planned Parenthood and all of that illegal activity have actually been indicted themselves by the grand jury for falsifying all of that information. And that story is nowhere near as big as I think it should be. Right? It's always like the accusations front page, but the retractions on page 8, and it feels like that in this situation.
Yeah. It's so frustrating. Yeah. I tweeted that out a whole bunch when that happened a couple weeks ago.
Oh, well, good. Maybe that's where I first heard about it, come to think about it. Also, come full circle. So the subject matter of Connected, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Connected started out where I wanted to collaborate with my dad on a movie. I thought that'd be very exciting. And I wanted to look at the history of connectedness from the Big Bang to the Industrial Revolution to today to the future. Where are we going? What is our desire to connect biologically, politically, sociologically? So I went through this whole thing, and I was making the film. And it was actually, I think back now, it was a very left-brain film at the time. It was very, analytical, provocative, but very intellectual. And I remember watching it, and I have to say that in the middle of making it, my father was diagnosed with brain cancer, which I'm sure you can imagine the irony of someone that had done so much work on the brain, and then to have that be the cancer that he got. And so I was just devastated with that news. And I was watching the movie, and I realized, how could I make a film about connectedness and not explore emotional connectedness? And I started taking apart the movie and making it really half a story about civilization and half my own story with losing my dad and some of his biggest ideas, and really wove the two together. And it was an intense film to make. Let's just say that. I mean, it's got a lot of humor in it too. I just made it sound so heavy, but I don't know. I mean, how would you describe it?
No, it does have a lot of humor in it, and it has a lot of hope in it. And I think the juxtaposition of the two things, the kind of, that scope, that large, more objective scope with the personal is it works on so many levels, because it brings together the right and left hemispheres. It brings together the personal and the universal, the kind of archetypal, and what Adolphe Bastien called the elementary ideas and the folk ideas, right? They all sort of come together in one package. I've watched the film 100 times and can't say enough about it, and show it in classes and recommend it to people, and I'm recommending it here to our audience. And one of the things that I love about it is this very thing, this twin element. And I think I've mentioned this on the show before, there's an author, a Christian author named C.S. Lewis. I'm sure you know his work. He wrote the Narnia books and a bunch of other stuff. And he was a Christian author and a philosopher, and he was the PhD of medieval poetry at Oxford University. And he wrote 2 books about suffering. And one was a very sort of academic. He wrote one. It's called The Problem of Pain, and he wrote as the PhD of medieval poetry at Oxford University. You know what I mean? And it reads like it was written by the PhD of medieval poetry at Oxford University. And it's a very systematic, historical, left-brain treatment of Western civilization's philosophical grappling with the notion of human suffering and why it happens and how to deal with that philosophically, right? So it's it actually is a pretty good academic historical treatment of the subject, but it's pretty sterile, right? And then he wrote another book about suffering, and that book's called A Grief Observed. And that book is, I don't know if you saw that movie Shadowlands a while back. that film is about Lewis's life, about this thing in particular. There was a woman who was an American Jewish communist atheist, right? Who was and C.S. Lewis was a bachelor up until like his 60s, and then he met this woman, and her son loved the C.S. Lewis books, and she would read them to him, and so she wrote Lewis and said, "We're coming to England on a trip. My son would like to meet you." And they all met, and then strangely, the woman and Lewis fell in love. Now he's this old Oxford Christian academic, and she's this like American Jewish atheist communist organizer, and somehow they fell in love, and got married. And Lewis had never even been sexually with another person, and then like she got cancer and died 3 years later, and she was like 42 or something, right? And
oh my God!
Yeah, and so he freaked
and so
out.
Grief Observed is about his relationship with her or losing her.
Yeah, and so he lost his mind basically for a second, and his publisher was like, "Hey, we need a book from you. You know, you got one coming up." And so he would, he'd wake up at 2 a.m, with these fever dreams about her, or in the middle of the afternoon something would happen, or he'd hear a song and he would collapse in the courtyard, with grief, and he would just grab a cocktail napkin or the back of a matchbook or whatever and just scrawl out these thoughts that were just going into nowhere, that were just getting words to this suffering that he was feeling, and he threw all that into a box and sent it to his publisher, and they threw it together and put the book out. And I tell you, that book is an interesting book about suffering, because that's a person in the middle of it, and it reads very different than the other one. But what I think is very powerful, if people are interested in even what we're saying here, is reading both books together, because one gives you the left brain kind of historical objective treatment, one gives you the personal and the personal transformation through loss. And the great thing about Connected is that you kind of do both things in the one place.
Thank you. Well, I'm definitely going to check out that book. It sounds really interesting. Yeah, Connected with so much processing, so many things. I mean, making films is really my way to process the world completely. Like, I can't not be making a film, because I'm always on to the next thing I'm trying to figure out once after I've finished a film. I can almost like immediately start thinking of the next thing, even as I'm days away from finishing.
That's interesting. I want to ask you, we're going to go to our next break, and I want to ask you what the next thing is, or at least what came after Connected, and then what you're working on now. And I just think that's a profound thought just to leave our listeners with before we go to break, is that, what I've been talking with you about is how inspirational, first your father's work and that your work is, and how, through your own processing, you've brought so much wisdom and compassion to us to sort of drink from. And I've always looked to your work as this gift you give to the world, but to hear you say that you're making these things, trying to process your own things, is a kind of fascinating thing to hear, because I've always looked at your work as an offering to the world.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I do also think of it as the way you just described it. Like, with what I learned in my processing, I can't wait to give it up to the world and share what I just learned. But usually at the beginning of a journey, I'm on a search. I'm trying to discover the true meaning of something, or the wisdom of something, or the essence of something, or some greater insight. And then once I've made the film, I've found it and I want to share it. And
Awesome.
So I think that's two parts of it.
There again, we have both aspects, right, combined in the one. All right, so we're going to go to our last break, folks. Can you hold over with us for one more segment? Yeah?
Yeah.
All right, folks, you're listening to On the Block Radio. Our guest is Tiffany Shlain, and we will be right back after these words.
A lot of us are wondering, what is all this technology doing to our brains? I mean, we know that the brain changes throughout life based on experiences. In fact, watching this movie is reshaping connections in your brain right now.
But since we humans are the ones creating and using this technology, maybe a better question to ask is, how are we shaping our brains? There's so much about the brain that we don't know. But there are some things we do know. You see, not long after we humans began thinking, we began thinking about ways to understand our own brains. One strategy thinkers have used throughout history is to compare the brain to the newest technology of their day. The brain is a clock, a switchboard, a steam engine, a machine, a computer. And we wondered, how can today's technology help us understand the brain in a new way? So we used that technology to ask people all over the world, how do you imagine the brain? It was amazing, like all these neurons firing ideas and images back to us from all over the world. And it was very clear. The internet, the most advanced technological system in the world, is such a strong framework to help understand the human brain, the most advanced biological system in the world. But then we thought about it a bit more. And since the internet is in such a young developmental stage, rapidly growing, constantly changing, forming billions of new connections all over the world, then maybe a stronger framework would be to compare it to a child's brain, which is in a similar stage of development, rapidly growing, constantly changing, and making billions upon billions of connections between different parts of the brain. So here's the question. If we say that the internet is in a similar developmental stage as a child's brain, then what can we learn by comparing them? Let's start with size. Obviously, the internet seems like a larger entity than a child's brain. But what does that mean in terms of our analogy? We could say that a neuron in the brain would be like a web page in the internet. So let's look at the number of neurons in a child's brain compared to the number of web pages on the internet. Well, a human at any age has about 100 billion neurons in the brain. But the internet has 10 times that, 1 trillion web pages. So with this analogy, the internet is bigger. So then, which of these networks is more complex? We could say a synapse in the brain, the connection point between two neurons, is like a hyperlink, the connection point between two web pages. So are there more connections in a child's brain or on the internet? Well, the internet has over 100 trillion links. And an adult's brain has 300 trillion links. But get this, a child's brain has a quadrillion connections, 10 times the number of connections of the entire internet. A child's brain has more connections than the entire internet. Yes, it blew our minds too. How is that even possible? Let's break it down. As we said, a baby is born with 100 billion neurons. But those quadrillion connections, they're not there yet. Those connections form at a very rapid speed during the first 5 years of life, at 700 to 1,000 new synapses per second. Those connections are created through every interaction a child has, and are important because they form the architecture of the brain. So every time you talk to and engage with a child, you are literally growing a brain, connecting the different parts of the brain, which allows for new ideas, insights, and creative thinking. So each moment of eye contact, each new word exchanged, each time you make a child laugh, you are strengthening these connections. And since there are so many different ways to do this, we asked people around the world, send us videos of your favorite ways to engage with the children in your life. During these early years, a child's brain makes as many connections as possible. And then it begins pruning the ones that aren't used and strengthening the ones that are. A dynamic process that continues throughout life. But since a child's brain is activated by everything it encounters, it can also be overwhelmed, which causes stress. When the brain experiences stress, the body's alarm system is activated. If the stress is relieved quickly, the system easily returns to normal. And while learning to deal with stress is an important part of development, severe situations such as ongoing abuse or neglect, where there is no caring adult to relieve the stress, leaves the body's alarm system activated, which can have serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Toxic stress can lead to a body system set permanently on high alert. It causes the synapses we use for learning and self-control to be pruned, while connections for fear and rash behavior get stronger. While the brain can change throughout the rest of life, these early years are fundamental in building a strong foundation for curiosity, creativity, and adaptability. And if we say that the internet is in the same critical stage of early development, making as many connections as possible, we also need to be mindful of how we're building its foundation. Just like every interaction creates new connections in a child's brain, every email, tweet, search, or post is creating and strengthening connections in our global brain, literally changing the shape of the internet that we as billions of people all over the world are developing together. And just as it's key for all the different parts of a child's brain to be connected to set the stage for the most insightful and creative thoughts, it's key that all the different parts of the world are connected to lay the foundation for worldwide empathy, innovation, and human expression. And while we don't know all the ways technology is reshaping our brains yet, we do know that every time we plug in, every person we follow, email, or link to, we know it's affecting us. So we need to be mindful of what we let into our brains, always. Which sometimes means knowing when to disconnect. Just as it's not good for a child's brain to be constantly over or understimulated, it's not good for an adult's brain either. For both the internet and a child's brain, the connections we pay most attention to will be strengthened, while the ones we use less will be pruned. So how do we nurture both of these growing interconnected networks to set a course for a better future? By paying attention to what we are paying attention to. Attention is the mind's most valuable resource. Every interaction counts. We all have the opportunity to shape the future of the world. And our future starts here.
This is Dr. Stanley Krippner, and you are listening to On the Block Radio.
left, we were talking about the movie Connected, and that was the sort of breakout film for you in this new phase in your life as an artist and filmmaker. And what, before we move on to the next projects you did and then what you have going on now, what was the takeaway from that film? What was the message that you wanted to leave people with at the end of that movie?
Well, it really culminates with what's the potential when we have everybody online? What can we do with that? And so that was a jumping off point for all of these collaborative films I've made, because really what was exciting to me is let me try to make something with people from all over the world using this technology. So I made the last line of Connected is for centuries we've been declaring independence, and perhaps it's time to finally declare our interdependence. And I wrote with my writing team a Declaration of Interdependence, a 1-minute script. We invited people all over the world to read it on camera. And it was just so beautiful to make this short 4-minute film. Moby did the music. It's a very powerful film that we released on Interdependence Day. And we call it cloud filmmaking. We've since made like 6 of these cloud films. And one of the more recent ones was called The Science of Character, which looked at the social science and neuroscience of character development, which is who you are and who you want to be. And we premiered that a couple years ago and started a nonprofit called Let It Ripple, which is also a line from Connected. And we did something called Character Day, which was a global day. Could we focus the world? So here's that thing that Connected taught me was what could we do collectively with all this technology, bringing people together to talk about important things. So we created Character Day to have this global day where everyone stops their busy lives and thinks about who they are and who they want to be with the latest neuro and social science research. And we just had the second annual last year. We had over 6,700 schools and organizations from 41 countries. And we premiered 2 new films with that. One was called The Adaptable Mind, and the other one was called The Making of a Mensch. And The Adaptable Mind is very much, I talk a lot about, everyone talks about STEM, science and engineering and math, but don't forget the STEAM, the A for the arts, and then we add the H for humanities, so not STEM, not STEAM, but STEAM.
Nice.
And anyways, we just announced the dates for our 3rd annual Character Day, which will be September 22nd. 2016. So that's kind of on my nonprofit side. I'm an artist in residence with my husband at a museum, which we'll be announcing soon. We'll have a big museum show this fall.
When do you sleep?
I sleep, but wait a second. You always ask me that. I made a lot of films. Okay, one of the things since my father passed away that's been pretty life-changing is that my family and I unplugged from technology for what we call our technology Shabbats. And we're on our 7th year of doing it, and I've made a lot of films about it. And so I play hard, work hard, relax hard. I don't work all the time. And I think most of my creativity comes from when I'm not doing anything. So I value that time immensely. In my 20s, I worked all the time. And I don't, I'm in my 40s now, and I don't value it. I don't think it's productive. I work hard when I work, but I also take the weekends off.
Yeah, there's been all this research about, great scientific breakthroughs that have come from, people walking away from the lab and taking a walk, right? Yeah. And then suddenly the thing comes. Well, I want to revisit a couple of things you just said a second ago about your work. Are you familiar with Jill Bolte Taylor's work?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Jill, have you guys spoken or worked together?
We've never met, but I love her work, and I think it's very powerful.
Her wonderful book, and then the TED Talk that accompanies it, The Stroke of Insight, right? As a brain scientist having a stroke and then being able to study her brain from the inside and what she, during that illness and her recovery and what she learned from it, about our potential to trigger ourselves back and forth between left and right hemispheric or combinations of those therein states of awareness. Is a really profound thing in the way she speaks about it. And there was a few other people I was going to ask you about. Do you know the neurologist or neuropsychologist Ian McGilchrist?
Yes.
his work on the divided brain is really phenomenal. And also for our listeners, the work of Jeremy Rifkin, who we hope to have on the program soon.
Yeah. Did you ever see a film I made for my show, The Future Starts Here? I did one called A Case for Dreaming.
No.
Oh, I think you'd really enjoy it. It looks at basically what happens to your mind when you're daydreaming and why so much creativity comes from that.
Mm.
It's called the Default Mode Network. I think you'd really enjoy it.
All right, we'll check that out. And we had a guy on last week named Mikey Siegel from the consciousness hacking movement. And I'm mentioning these names because it's leading to a question. And one more person to mention while I'm thinking about it, a friend of the show, Billy Goldman, who's a VP of marketing at Intel, who works in like these making social films and branded content, and her stuff is more involved in like, you know, selling computers for Dell or Toshiba or something, but nonetheless there's people that are doing really interesting things with conscious business or conscious hacking and trying to find ways to use technology, right, to bring people together and fundamentally change the way they interact with one another, the way they interact with the natural world, and the way they interact with the larger biosphere and the cosmos. And so there's this huge movement now of tech people and of engineers and of creative folks that are really following, and I'm not, you know, kissing your ass here, but are really following in your footsteps and trying to find ways to, how are we going to use these technologies not to just have people consume, not to just have people obsess over themselves and post pictures of their burrito or their cat or something, but to really start using these technologies to enhance people's well-being, to enhance their physical and mental and spiritual well-being, and to enhance their connectedness to one another. We're just at the beginning of starting to understand what we can possibly do with these technologies. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're just like 5 years away from everyone being connected, and I think we're going to see insights we can't even imagine. I mean, I wrote this book called Brain Power, which kind of looked at the importance of nurturing a child's brain from birth to 5 years. Like, that's when the most growth happens. And I compare it to the growth of the internet and how do we nurture and proactively develop the internet just as we would a child's brain. And I think there's a lot of comparison. And a child doesn't have its first insight until all the different parts of the brain are connected. So, you know, I think if you telegraph that out to the internet, when we get everyone connected who wants to be connected on the internet from every different perspective, that's when we're going to see breakthroughs happen we can't even imagine. From the bumping, you know, Matt Ridley, I don't know if you know his work, but he wrote that great book, The Rational Optimist, that talks about ideas having sex and that you need the most diverse perspectives to come together to have true insights. And I think when we see everyone online in five or six, however many years, it's not very far away, we're going to see things we can't even imagine. Just as we're seeing the scale of so many people being online, already how powerful that is.
Yeah, and just a practical example here in our last couple of minutes, I think I was even watching something like, you know, one of those Morgan Freeman programs that he does about, you know, breakthroughs that are going on in technology, and he was talking about or showing, it might have been that, it might not have been, but they were talking about a group of grad students in England who were working on some particular problem in genetics, and they made some breakthrough and then published their results on the internet. And the thing is that research labs and like amateur scientists all around the world instantaneously go to work on examining and retesting and checking those results, whereas even 20, 30 years ago, someone would have to write those up, send them around, get them checked, get them in a journal, go to a conference. It'd be 6-8 months before you get another set of eyes on those results, as opposed to when you post them this afternoon, by tomorrow morning, 30,000 other labs have already looked at them and are going to work on it. And that's remarkable. The implications that we're going to start coming from that, like you said, over the next 5 years, I don't think people even really understand yet.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So what do you have? Oh, go ahead. Sorry, finish that. And then
I was going to say, in The Future Starts Here, my show, I did 2 seasons of that. I explore a lot of what we were just talking about. There's an episode called Idea Porn that goes into that. Also, The Future of Our Species. That kind of talks about my father's last book and my thoughts about where we're going. But that show, I explore a lot of those ideas.
Yeah, can we talk about that in our final 2 minutes here? Because that show, I mean, you're being very modest. That show's won some pretty heady awards, right? That show's making a huge splash out there in exploring, in being not only in the content you're providing, but again, in the way you're delivering it and the people you're engaging and the way the whole thing's put together. So can you tell us a little bit about that project?
Yeah, that has been really exciting. I basically was, I was asked to do short films about kind of whatever was interesting to me, and I'm interested by so many things. It was hard to decide what to do, but we really explored everything from creativity to neuroscience to technology to being a parent to all this stuff. And the reception, it got nominated for an Emmy Award, and it's had over 40 million views, which is so thrilling for an independent filmmaker to get.
Yeah, you're so funny because you go, I make this little show, The Future Starts Here, and I was hoping we'd get to those numbers. Yeah, it's exactly right. You were 40 million views, nominated for an Emmy, so that's doing really well. And where can people find that show?
They can go to just futurestartshere.com, and you'll see all the episodes there.
You're in the second season now?
We did the second season, and I was deciding whether to do a third, or I have a new show idea that looks at kind of women and power, and I'm thinking about doing that next because I can't do them both.
Right. So yeah, that's our final question for you. What's on the horizon? What are you working on next?
I'm just developing a new show that I really like doing a series that was very fun, and I'm just developing that.
That one you just mentioned?
Yeah, I'm just at the early stages, which is a very fun part for me, where the idea is just taking shape. So it's very fun.
And people can find your work at the Moxie Institute?
moxieinstitute.org, or they can just go to Tiffany Shlain. I'm on Twitter a lot, just at Tiffany Shlain, and on Facebook. And then I have a quarterly newsletter called Breakfast at Tiffany's. And I've been doing that for like 18 years.
Well branded, by the way. That's beautiful.
It's kind of a combination of projects I'm working on and a lot of other cool work that people I know are doing or that I think is interesting, films, podcasts.
We'll put a link to that for folks. I've been a subscriber of that newsletter for a few years now, and it's great because it's written in that very kind of funny, personable voice of yours, and it has links to things when you're doing new social films or those cloud films. If people want to send you stuff or connect to it, they can get all through that newsletter, so it's great. Yeah. Hey, lastly, what was it like working with Diane Sawyer? You were with ABC for a while as a tech person, right?
Yeah, she was great. She was really a great mentor when I was doing that show. I learned a lot. Actually, I feel like that whole experience, it was a very funny period where I was, doing the Webby Awards, and I was trying to explain this thing called the web to the public.
Yeah, that was so awesome, right? Like introducing an alien species or something.
It was like I was coming from the future with my funky hairdo and whatever, and I was explaining to them this thing that was coming to them.
You got to find that footage and put it on 12 Monkeys or something. It's amazing.
Well, it's funny. It's so weird that you brought it up because I just realized, God, I got to get all my episodes. So I just ordered them this week to get all the different episodes I did. So
you might be able to do something with that. I think it's really, really great stuff. Tiffany, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's been an absolute delight.
It's such a pleasure. Have a great weekend.
You too. You've been listening to On the Block Radio, folks. Our guest has been the filmmaker and activist and media mogul, Tiffany Shlain, and we will see you on the other side.
You've been listening to On the Block with Andrew Gurevich. The show is produced in Portland, Oregon by Michael DiNapoli at MD Productions. Theme music by Cat Power. Closing music by Jonathan Oak. Look us up on the web at ontheblockradio.com, where you can also link to us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Don't forget to tune in next week for a brand new episode. Previous episodes can be found on our website. Thanks for listening.
Oh, you beautiful kitties. Oh, look at you out there. Creators of art, of history, of thought.